The borderlands had always lived with shadows, but under the reign of the man they called El Fantasma, the ghost, those shadows became suffocating. His presence wasn't just feared. It was mythologized. Mothers whispered his name in hushed tones. Fathers warned their sons never to cross the wrong man, and entire villages seemed to vanish into silence when his lieutenants rolled through in armored convoys. El Fantasma had clawed his way to the top of Mexico's most brutal cartel through a ruthless blend of intelligence, paranoia, and unrelenting violence. Unlike flamboyant bosses before him, who flaunted gold-plated pistols and posed for narco ballads, the ghost remained invisible. He never gave interviews, never recorded messages, never left a trail. Photos of him were decades old, blurry, and often disputed. Even his own lieutenants rarely saw him in person. To the people who lived under his grip, he was both everywhere and nowhere at once. But his violence was not invisible. From Nuevo Laredo to Phoenix, his signature could be read in mass graves, in trucks stuffed with migrants abandoned in deserts, in headless bodies hung from bridges as warnings. His men operated with military discipline uniforms, encrypted radios, night vision gear stolen from corrupt military caches. Where older cartels ran like businesses, his ran like a private army. They extorted, kidnapped, and killed with terrifying efficiency. For U.S. law enforcement, El Fantasma was a phantom who mocked their efforts. D-agents tracked his shipments, but could never pin them to him. FBI analysts listened to hours of intercepted calls, only to find his voice absent. Border Patrol seized drugs and cash, yet the higher structure of his network remained intact. He was always 2 steps ahead, as if he anticipated every raid, every sting. And in a way, he did. Rumors swirled that El Fantasma had once studied in the United States, perhaps even attended an elite military academy under a false identity. Some said he learned counterintelligence from ex-Special Forces operatives gone rogue. Others that he had CIA manuals locked away in a mountain bunker. Whatever the truth, one fact remained. He understood his enemy better than they understood him. His cruelty ensured loyalty. A mayor who refused to cooperate was kidnapped during a campaign rally. His body was returned days later, broken, his mouth stuffed with campaign flyers. A journalist who reported on cartel operations was never found, her last article ending mid-sentence. Even mid-level enforcers who dared cross him were made examples of, their mutilated corpses paraded through their own neighborhoods. Entire towns bled under his iron grip. Businesses paid taxes directly to his men or faced immediate retribution. Police forces were infiltrated. Many wore 2 uniforms, one for the state, one for the ghost. In one infamous incident, 30 officers in a border town resigned in a single night after a message was delivered. We know your families. Choose wisely. To the public, El Fantasma became a legend, half man, half specter. Children grew up hearing stories of him, how he could vanish into the mountains, how bullets never touched him, how his enemies simply disappeared. For the poor, some saw him as a twisted form of justice, a man who built schools and gave handouts when the government failed them. For the powerful, he was an untouchable threat, destabilizing both sides of the border. By 2016, his empire stretched from Mexico's Sierra Madre Mountains to distribution hubs in Houston, Los Angeles, and Chicago. Billions of dollars flowed through his operations annually. His cartel moved not just cocaine, heroin, and methamphetamine, but also weapons, humans, and stolen technology. And still, his face remained hidden, his name unspoken. Washington could no longer ignore him. Inside Pentagon briefing rooms and CIA task force offices, his name was circled in red. Reports painted him as more than just a drug trafficker. He was a destabilizing force, threatening national security. Corrupt politicians on both sides of the border were in his pocket. Military deserters joined his ranks. Intelligence suggested he was experimenting with drones for smuggling and surveillance, even modifying them with explosives. His cartel had effectively become a paramilitary organization. But the challenge wasn't just his power, it was his invisibility. Every attempt to infiltrate his inner circle ended in blood. Informants were burned before they could provide details. Technology that should have tracked him, satellites, surveillance planes, hacked phones, only traced his men, never him. He was untouchable. And then came the turning point. In late 2017, a convoy of his lieutenants ambushed a joint task force near Reynosa, leaving 7 Mexican Marines dead and 3 liaisons critically injured. The attack was bold, deliberate, and carried out with near-military precision. For the first time, U.S. officials publicly acknowledged a Tier 1 cartel threat. Privately, however, the conversation was darker. El Fantasma wasn't just a criminal. He was a warlord. Within weeks, the White House Situation Room buzzed with debates. Could they launch a direct strike? Could they capture him alive? Diplomats warned of international backlash if the U.S. violated sovereignty. Intelligence officers warned that arresting him could trigger all-out war among cartels. But one consensus emerged: his reign had to end. The decision would not be made lightly. For every whisper of action, there was pushback. Military brass cautioned against another forever war. Politicians feared exposure. But in the dark corridors of Washington, a secret directive began to take shape. It would not be a war, not an invasion. It would be a scalpel, not a hammer. The order was clear. El Fantasma must die. And so, the United States prepared to hunt a ghost. When intelligence finally painted a coherent picture of El Fantasma's reach, the problem in Washington was not whether to act, it was how. The corridors of power thronged with unease. On the polished tables of secure rooms, briefers laid out maps, satellite stills, and redacted transcripts that read like the dossier of a petty dictator. Chiefs of staff leaned forward. Senators demanded answers. At the center of the storm was a simple, brutal question. Could the United States remove a man who hid like a ghost without becoming the monster the law sought to stop? The options were few, and each carried a cost. Diplomatic pressure had never worked with men who responded to power with bullets. Arrest relied on cooperating with local authorities, who, the reports warned, were compromised by bribery, fear, or both. A large-scale military operation was unthinkable. Troops on foreign soil would inflame a national pride, risk civilian casualties, and provoke a diplomatic crisis with Mexico that neither government could survive politically. The more clandestine the operation, the higher the legal and ethical stakes. Someone would have to sign off on killing a foreign national on foreign soil with no public admission. That someone would have to accept the consequences. Inside the Pentagon's secure auditorium, the debate took on the cadence of a slow-moving storm. Uniformed generals spoke in clipped language about risk matrices and rules of engagement. They warned about escalation. A strike could reverberate across cartel networks, triggering vendettas, reprisals, and a spike in violence on both sides of the border. Intelligence chiefs, hair grayed by long nights, argued that leaving El Fantasma untouched guaranteed a drip of blood, not a flood, predictable death, and steady erosion of law and order. Diplomats, heads bowed, reminded their colleagues that Mexican sovereignty was sacrosanct. Any overt American operation would be a humiliation the Mexican government could not stomach. Then there was the legal calculus. Attorney generals and legal counsels parsed treaties and statutes, quoting phrases about extraterritorial use of force, the narrow exceptions for imminent threat, and the need for host nation consent. In backrooms, lawyers drafted contingency memos that would have to be shredded or hidden, debating whether to characterize a strike as an act of self-defense or a covert operation conducted with deniability. For every lawyer who argued for restraint, another argued that inaction was itself a form of abdication. If El Fantasma's drones could be weaponized, if his cartels could destabilize regions, then preemption was defensible, morally fraught, legally brittle, but perhaps necessary. Public opinion was a different beast. The White House understood that any hint of U.S. boots on Mexican soil would be political dynamite. Partisans would seize on it for months. Allies would demand explanations. Adversaries would weaponize the narrative. Yet the families of those killed, the business owners whose livelihoods were destroyed, and the communities hollowed out by terror wanted something definitive. Officials worried about the precedent too. Authorize one covert strike and you risk normalizing extraterritorial killings as policy. Beneath the lawyers and diplomats, career intelligence officers moved like chess players planning a gambit. They had been collecting fragments for years, intercepted messages, financial ledgers, human sources who dared to whisper names over static-filled lines. Slowly, the invisible figure began to take shape. Analysts produced a pattern of life. The balcony at dawn, the convoy routes, the way dinners were staggered to reduce risk. It was maddening detail. Maddening because the window it revealed was brief and bordered by impossibility. But in the world of covert ops, even impossibility was an invitation. A classified interagency task force formed, small and secret by design. It included officers from the Joint Special Operations Command, specialists from Naval Special Warfare, intelligence analysts from the CIA, and legal advisors from the Department of Justice. A mosaic of institutional cultures that normally distrusted one another. They met in the kind of secure room that had no name on any directory, drinking bad coffee and sifting through layers of redaction. Each meeting wrapped with the same two conclusions. El Fantasma had become too dangerous to tolerate, and any solution would have to be surgical, deniable, and nearly impossible to trace. That word, deniable, governed every decision. If the operation could be linked to the American government, the political fallout would be catastrophic. If it failed, the operatives themselves would be fugitives, dangling in limbo with no official rescue plan. There was no room for error, ethically or tactically. The task force began to explore a narrow range of options that met the criteria. A precision strike from range, an assassination staged to look like an internal power struggle, or a covert capture by indigenous forces coached and equipped anonymously. Each option had fatal flaws. Capture required relying on local partners whose loyalties were suspect. Staging a power struggle meant playing with lives like currency. The long-range strike, if it could be done without trace, was the only one that promised surgical elimination with minimal immediate blowback. But long-range strikes came with their own portfolio of risks. They raised questions that were technical, legal, and moral. Could a bullet cross 2 miles of mountain air with the reliability needed? Would a strike from that distance allow forensic investigators to trace the weapon's origins? Could the operation be arranged without detectable air or electronic signatures? The kind of shot being discussed existed at the extreme edge of marksmanship. It required physics, meteorology, and warm muscle memory to converge perfectly. Yet the task force had people who believed in such edges, men and women who spent careers pushing limits until possibility bent. Political leaders watched these discussions with nervous hands. The president and a small group of national security advisors were briefed in compartmented sessions. Some urged patience. Others urged action. In the end, the argument that swayed the balance was visceral and human. Leave him, and he would kill more. Remove him, and there might be space for life to return. The calculus was not mathematical. It was moral, painful, and irreversible. With that, a directive was authorized, narrow, specific, and classified to the highest degree. It did not order a war. It did not authorize troops or airstrikes. It ordered the assembly of a small, deniable team capable of operating outside conventional detection ranges and within strict rules of engagement that emphasized minimization of collateral damage and sovereign footprint. The order included limits: no capture, no overt U.S. presence on Mexican soil, and an absolute requirement for plausible deniability if anything leaked. The mission would have to be a whisper that left no echo. Now the problem shifted from theory to execution. Military planners descended into the practicalities. Who could perform such a shot? How to reach an overwatch position without being observed? And how to ensure communications were sterile and compartmented? Special Operations Command began a quiet talent search. They looked for snipers with not just skill, but a temperament that could tolerate the loneliness of a long-range shot and the ethical gravity of taking a life in such absolute terms. They sought spotters who could do math in their heads, calculating wind speeds, air pressure, and even the minuscule effect of the Earth's rotation on a bullet's arc. Technicians were tasked with sourcing weapons that left no traceable signature, while logisticians planned infiltration routes that avoided radars and patrols. At the same time, diplomats worked behind the scenes to keep the partnership with Mexico intact without exposing it to political risk. Some Mexican officials were quietly informed, not all, but enough to ensure that hopeless pursuit did not end diplomatic catastrophe. Others remained in the dark, so deniability could be preserved if the operation went public. The balancing act was delicate. Too much cooperation threatened exposure. Too little risked operational failure. For every choice, someone's career and someone's conscience was at stake. Within the task force, a few people felt the moral weight more keenly than others. A legal advisor wrote memos that read like confessions, cataloging the ramifications of extrajudicial force. A CIA officer, veteran of long, quiet wars, closed the folder and stared at a photograph of a child who had lost his father to cartel violence. He thought of the math of suffering, a line of black ink that represented a life cut short. The operation, he told himself, would not erase harm done, but it might prevent more. As preparations accelerated, secrecy hardened into ritual. Operatives were briefed in cells, travel plans were indirect, and equipment moved under layers of false manifests. For those selected, the mission became a cold certainty. Training ranges expanded to mimic the mountainous terrain. Wind tunnels were consulted, and hypothetical scenarios were replayed until muscle memory took over. Still, everyone knew the unknowns remained. A sudden gust of wind, a neighbor's dog barking at the wrong moment, the single human variable that could topple the plan. At the end of the long, pressure-filled days, the decision-makers returned to the same quiet room and stared at the map of a compound in a mountain valley. The path forward carried risk, shame, and the potential for relief. The moral line they crossed would be debated for years, in bars, classrooms, and perhaps courtrooms. For now, they closed ranks. The directive stood. A deniable surgical operation would proceed. If successful, lives might be spared. If it failed, the fallout would be severe. The nation's leaders had chosen. And in a cold, anonymous hallway somewhere in the bowels of the Pentagon, an aide passed a list to a commander. Names were circled, faces blurred into duty. The mission's framework was complete. The task of choosing the men who would cross a border without ever being acknowledged began. They called him Chief Petty Officer Daniel Cross on paper, but among the few who knew him best, he was simply Cross, an austere name for an austere man. He had the quiet look of someone for whom sleep was optional and discipline permanent. Narrow shoulders that had learned to carry burdens. A jawline weathered by years of salt and sun. And eyes that measured distance the way other men measured time. He had been raised in a Rust Belt town where the nearest horizon was a factory smokestack. The Navy had given him horizons he never imagined. Somewhere along the way, precision had become his religion. Naval Special Warfare Command did not advertise its selection criteria in recruitment pamphlets. It showed up in offhand remarks, in the way men listened when another spoke, in the way a trainee learned to let silence fill the space where panic wanted to shout. Cross had passed through every gauntlet cold water training, impossible marshes, and nights that felt longer than years. But sniping was different. It was less about bravado and more about conversation with physics, patience, and the small, exacting rituals that kept a bullet from becoming treacherous. Cross loved those rituals because they were a place where control still existed. The team assembled for the task was intentionally small, lean enough to vanish into rumor, broad enough to cover the gaps that chance insisted on leaving. There was Ramirez, the spotter, an analytical mind wrapped in a broad-shouldered frame. Ramirez came from a border town, his accent a soft cadence that betrayed long family ties on both sides. He could read a landscape the way a poet read a stanza. To him, shadows were punctuation and wind was a sentence waiting to be parsed. He and Cross had been paired for years, a tacit partnership that had outlived other friendships and marriages. They shared a language of gestures and half-sentences, the shorthand of people whose lives depended on each other's predictions. Others on the roster were less visible, but no less vital. A communications technician with the humor of someone who had stared at static for too long. A medic whose calm hands had stitched more than bodies, sometimes dignity. And a reconnaissance specialist who could move across moonlit scrub as if gravity were an optional law. Each man had stories that did not translate well to briefings' quiet failures and private triumphs that lent muscle and grit to the team's reputation. The mission would call for more than skill. It would demand temperament. Selection for deniable operations was never just technical. It was psychological triage. Commanders tested how a man held up when the certainties of training evaporated. Could he sleep with the knowledge that, if discovered, official rescue would be impossible? Could he accept that official history would never mention their names? Could he see a target on a balcony and still remember the child behind the curtain? It was the last question that winnowed men faster than any physical trial. Cross and Ramirez had already answered it for themselves. They had watched footage of funerals and open graves enough to know the calculus. The brief that pulled them from routine came in a way that all such briefs do, abruptly and half-breathed. The secure room held a hush that was almost sacred. Maps lay open like confessions. The directive was as explicit as it was impossible. Remove the leader, known as El Fantasma, with surgical discretion. It was the kind of order that collapsed the future into a single, stark present. Cross read the packet twice, then folded it with the care of a man who handles small, dangerous things. Training for the mission was focused and elliptical. It mirrored the need for secrecy by being fragmented, each cell trained on a slice of the task, never the whole. In one facility, Cross worked on long-range marksmanship under light conditions engineered to be unfamiliar, simulated altitudes, variable air densities, the shadow play of mountain ridgelines. He practiced breathing like a metronome, learning to make his heartbeat a background note rather than a profile to be read. Ramirez rehearsed calculations in their head until numbers were not numbers, but textures, gusts that felt like whispers, pressure changes that tasted like rain. The medic rehearsed casualty drills that were, by design, theoretical. The communications tech ran dark comms exercises that involved jargon as much as trust. They trained until instincts replaced thinking. The idea was not to rehearse the mission so much as to teach the body to move through uncertainty as if it were a pattern. Cross sometimes woke in the middle of the night and practiced muscle sequences. Mount his rifle, adjust the bipod, close the ocular. Ritual, again a map of safety in a world that offered none. Even with training, They were practical puzzles that refused to be solved by repetition. How to approach a target compound and vanish into geography rather than footsteps. How to carry equipment that would not flag them on sensors and yet be robust enough to survive a sudden sprint. How to accept rules that forbade a traditional extraction. Each problem was a chessman with teeth. Each solution required ingenuity without improvisation, discipline without inflexibility. As the operation neared, Cross allowed himself a small indulgence. A walk through an old field behind the base, where the cold air felt like a clean slate. He thought about his father, who had taught him to measure distance by the way corn rows disappeared into the horizon. He thought about wife he left behind, who had learned to live with his absences as if absence itself could be domesticated. He thought about the faces of those who had been killed by Cartel's names on slides and briefings, but also the father of a child buried under a crooked tree, the vendor whose shop had been burned down. Responsibility is a heavy coin. Cross had learned to carry it in a pocket that never jingled. On the eve of departure, there was a ritual that had nothing to do with weapons. The team gathered in a low-lit room and passed around a small, tattered book poems and short notes left there by those who had gone before. It was an odd collection, a collage of human things that cut cleanly through technicality. A prayer, a joke, a recipe for stew. They did not speak of failure. They did not josh about glory. They absorbed silence as if it were instruction. Then they kissed dog tags that were not theirs and moved toward the door. The insertion plan discussed in cryptic euphemisms favored stealth over speed. It meant traveling into a landscape that belonged to others and learning to walk as if the earth were a guest. Cross thought of mountains as pages, each ridge a paragraph that narrated their approach. They moved at night, folding themselves into the contours of rock and scrub, becoming a rumor that the land recited to itself. When they paused, it was not to rest, but to listen to stray dogs, to the rhythm of tree branches, to the tick of an unseen insect. Every sound could be a clue or a calamity. Cross and Ramirez spoke rarely on the approach. Their conversations took the form of gestures, tilts of the head, nods that were precise like punctuation. When they did speak, it was to say mundane things in a voice that kept panic at bay. A reminder of a ration pack buried in a pouch. A comment about the stars. Humor had a place even there, in a whispered joke about the absurdity of the sniper's loneliness. It landed like a pebble in a vast quiet, making ripples that steadied the water. The final night before the operation was the solemnity of people standing on the lip of an impossible thing. Each member checked gear with the same meticulousness, as if that sequence were a liturgy that might sway fate. Cross inspected his rifle in silence, fingers moving over metal and wood with reverence, as a priest might bless a relic. Ramirez laid out charts like a lover arranging letters. The medic taped bandages with calm hands. They were all actors in a play whose script they only half owned. When the transport moved out at last, quiet, unremarkable, staged like any military convoy, leaving a base, Cross did not look backward. He did not need to. The mission had already become a landscape inside him, a valley of calculation, a ridge of memory, a balcony he had not yet seen. What mattered was the moment they would be alone with decisions that had no instruction manual. There would be no applause afterward, no medals pinned in public. If they succeeded, the world would shrug and keep counting headlines. If they failed, lives would be counted differently, and names would be read in a slow, painful cadence. Still, as the vehicle carried them toward a horizon that married danger and necessity, Cross felt the familiar clarity that preceded action. In that clarity, there was no arrogance, only a solemn understanding that the line they were stepping across might never be drawn back. He touched the small photograph tucked inside his kit. A boy, perhaps 6, grinning with missing front teeth. Cross closed his eyes, and in that private moment, promised the boy nothing grander than this: he would return. Whether the promise was hubris or hope, only the valley ahead could say. For months, the intelligence war against El Fantasma had been an exercise in frustration. Drones tracked convoys, wiretaps listened to men shouting orders in tin-roofed rooms, and satellites painted the landscape in black and white clarity, yet the man himself never appeared. He was a ghost who traveled without record, leaving only the aftermath of his power: mass graves, smoldering vehicles, and terrified witnesses who swore they had never seen his face. But ghosts are creatures of pattern, and patterns, if studied long enough, can reveal a sliver of humanity. That was how the analysts finally found him. It began with a drone orbit over the Sierra Madre, a desolate stretch of mountains where rivers cut through dry valleys like scars. The analysts at Langley had been monitoring encrypted chatter between lieutenants. The messages contained nothing incriminating, only mundane exchanges about coffee deliveries, furniture repairs, and morning walks. Yet one word recurred in too many threads: balcony. At first, no one paid it much attention. But when human intelligence sources paid informants, who risked their lives for scraps of dollars, whispered that El Fantasma was a man of rigid habit, a picture began to form. He was said to rise before dawn, drink coffee on his balcony, and take in the air for exactly 3 minutes before retreating inside. 3 minutes of exposure at a predictable time in a predictable place. It was the kind of break intelligence officers lived for. The compound itself was another puzzle. Carved into a valley in the mountains, it was more fortress than mansion. Walls 12 feet high circled the perimeter, topped with cameras and motion sensors. Watchtowers stood at each corner, manned with armed guards. Beyond the walls, the terrain itself was hostile jagged ridges, cactus fields, and ravines. Roads in and out were blocked by checkpoints, and overhead surveillance drones provided constant watch. Getting close was impossible. Entering the compound was suicide. Even Mexican federal forces, when they tried to raid lesser hideouts, had suffered catastrophic ambushes. This fortress was impregnable. Unless, of course, you didn't need to breach it at all. That was the revelation. Distance could be the weapon. If El Fantasma stepped onto his balcony every dawn, and if the right vantage point could be found within range, the fortress itself became irrelevant. The mountain ridges overlooking the valley were vast, rugged, and largely unpatrolled. A sniper could disappear into them like a needle into hay. There was only one problem. The balcony sat 3,200 meters, just under 2 miles from the nearest viable ridge. It was a distance so extreme that many dismissed it as fantasy. At that range, a bullet's flight was no longer a straight line, but a slow arc across time and gravity. Wind gusts, temperature shifts, even the Earth's rotation, all conspired to push a round-off target. A man could fire 1,000 times and miss 999. But the task force knew someone who might just make the one shot that mattered: Daniel Cross. The analysts presented their findings in a secure briefing. Maps littered the table, topographic overlays, drone stills, infrared patterns showing guard rotations. One image showed the balcony in sharp relief, a simple stone terrace jutting from the second floor, overlooking the valley below. A red circle marked the balcony. A second red circle, miles away on a mountain ridge, marked the possible firing position. Between them stretched nothing but air, distance, and chance. "This is your window," the lead analyst said. 3 minutes. Every dawn. "If we can get the team here," he tapped the ridge with a finger, "we can make this happen. But the shot is 3,200 meters. It's nearly impossible." The room went quiet. Ramirez, the spotter, leaned forward, studying the map as if it were scripture. Cross said nothing. He didn't need to. His silence was its own language, one the team had learned to trust. When he finally spoke, it was not bravado, not arrogance, just calm certainty. "Get me on that ridge," he said. "I'll put him down." The preparation that followed was exhaustive. Analysts simulated weather conditions, pulling decades of data on wind patterns in the valley. They modeled sunrise angles, ensuring the sniper would not be blinded by glare. They tested ballistic calculations again and again, feeding them into software and cross-checking with human estimations. For every variable, there was a margin of error, and for every margin of error, Ramirez worked to reduce it. Cross, meanwhile, lived in repetition. On a secret range carved into a canyon in the American Southwest, he practiced shots at distances that bent the limits of marksmanship. The targets were small steel plates, painted the same dull color as stone. When the bullet struck home, the sound was delayed, echoing across the desert seconds later. Cross did not celebrate hits, nor curse misses. He logged them, adjusted, and fired again. Each round was data, not emotion. Ramirez stood beside him, recording wind speeds, humidity, barometric pressure. "That gust?" He'd murmur. "That's 2 clicks left at 2,000. Cross would nod, adjust, and fire. Their partnership became a ritual of trust, numbers married to muscle memory. As weeks turned into months, the operation's shape solidified. The insertion route was chosen, a covert infiltration through rugged terrain under the cover of night, avoiding patrols and sensors. The extraction plan was equally Spartan. Melt back into the wilderness. No helicopters, no air support, nothing that could leave a signature. The mission's strength would be its silence. Washington watched with a mixture of fascination and dread. High-level officials were briefed in whispers. Some were captivated by the sheer audacity of the plan, a single shot to decapitate a criminal empire. Others recoiled at the risks. If the mission failed, the fallout would be catastrophic. If it succeeded, no one could ever take credit. The president was briefed in the Oval Office. "This is the cleanest option we'll ever get," the National Security Advisor said. "No troops, no bombs, no collateral. One man, one shot." The president studied the briefing packet in silence. On the map, the 2 red circles stared back, balcony and ridge. Target and sniper. Ghost and hunter. Finally, the president signed the directive. "Make it happen. And make sure no one ever knows we did." The order cascaded down through the chain of command, encrypted and compartmented. At Naval Special Warfare, Cross and his team received final confirmation. The operation was real. No longer a simulation, no longer theory. In weeks, maybe days, they would be on the ground. That night, Cross sat alone in his quarters, cleaning his rifle. He worked methodically, the way a man polishes a sacred object. Every part was stripped, inspected, oiled, and reassembled. He ran his fingers along the barrel, whispering numbers under his breath. Distance, wind, elevation. For him, the rifle was not just a weapon. It was a bridge between the impossible and the inevitable. Ramirez entered, carrying charts. "Weather's our enemy," he said softly. "If we get even a 10-knot crosswind, it's game over." Cross looked up, eyes calm. "Then we wait for still air." Ramirez smirked. "Still air doesn't exist." Cross slid the bolt into place with a quiet click. "Then we make it exist." The breakthrough was no longer just an intelligence find. It had become a living mission, breathing inside each man who would carry it. For months, they had chased a ghost. Now, for 3 minutes every dawn, the ghost would stand in the open, a cup of coffee in hand, believing himself untouchable. And somewhere, miles away, a sniper lay waiting, ready to prove that no man, not even a ghost, was beyond reach. They moved like shadows, that had learned to respect terrain. The approach to the ridge was not a march, but a long, patient negotiation with the land itself. Cross, Ramirez, and two others, Milana, the communications technician, and Ortiz, the recon specialist, left in the murky hours after midnight, when the valley below slept and the compound sensors seemed to breathe slower. They traveled light, rifles, a handful of rounds, rations that tasted of cardboard, and an obsessive amount of planning folded into waterproof pouches. Every ounce mattered because at those elevations, weight multiplied into fatigue. The first hours were mechanical. They slipped through mesquite and cholla cactus, careful to avoid the whisper of broken branches underfoot. Ortiz led, moving with the soft certainty of someone who could find a path where maps showed none. The men communicated in the tiny vocabulary of the practiced. Index fingers tapped the brows for halt. Two knuckles meant zero. A slow dash of the hand meant down. They had rehearsed the choreography until muscle memory became a referee for fear. Heat clung to their backs even at night, a reminder that the desert never fully cooled. The land exhaled dry, scratchy air that lodged in throats and turned breathing into a business. They halted twice to hide from patrol lights, thin beams that cut through the darkness like knives. Each time a truck rumbled past on the far ridge, breath held in chests, pulses slowed through counting. It was not courage alone that carried them forward. It was method, tiny increments of progress stitched into hours. At dusk, when the horizon began to bruise, Ortiz signaled a stop. For nearly an hour, the team lay flat under the lip of a sandstone outcrop and watched the valley below glimmer with a few stubborn lights, the compound's perimeter bulbs, a thin glow of a guard cigarette, a distant smear of a town. From that vantage, the canyon swallowed sound. Conversations far below were a muffled dream. Cross pulled out a thermos and handed small sips of bitter coffee around. The liquid slid down warmly and without pretense. They did not talk about what awaited them. Talk felt like an invitation to fate. The route they chose deliberately avoided the direct ridgeline visible from the compound's cameras. Instead, they threaded a circuitous path up a lesser-traveled wash, a dry riverbed that had once been water, and now was a corridor of loose rock and hidden footholds. Climbing it required time and strategy. The wind picked up in predictable gusts that swept down from high cliffs, carrying with it the metallic tang of dust. Ramirez watched the wind like a man watching an enemy's breathing. He felt it in his teeth and charted it in his head. Night work magnified small hazards until they seemed monstrous. A misstep on a scree slope, a gloved hand catching on a thorn, a radio ping that might be a distant patrol or a goat. Molina wrapped the team's communications in silence, old-school field discipline. Radios dead, except for a single encrypted channel they would use only when necessary. Electronic signatures had been the contagion they most feared. A stray transmission, and every movement could become a map. They advanced in leaps, then held, then inched. Dawn was unreliable. Daybreak often arrived with decisions that could not be postponed. Their timeline had been built on the balcony's 3-minute window at first light. Miss that window, and months of planning dissolved like mist. So when the ridge finally loomed, its silhouette a ragged tooth against the paling, sky urgency tightened like a wire in their joints. The final climb was treacherous. Loose shale slid like pebbles under their boots. Ortiz used a climbing harness sparingly, trusting foot placement over rope where possible to avoid shine. Cross felt his muscles twitch with familiar aches, but steadied them with breathing drills he'd practiced 1,000 times. Each pull up the cliff face was a small victory, a concession to gravity that demanded respect. When they reached the primary firing position, a narrow ledge with a view that the world seemed to have reserved for vultures, they paused, not to celebrate, but to inventory. Cross set his rifle on a bipod with fingers that had the practiced gentleness of someone handling an instrument he feared losing to fate. He checked the ballistic computer, loaded around, then backed away to allow Ramirez and Molina to run final calculations. The air at that altitude tasted thin, and each breath felt like drawing on a small interest in life. Ramirez unrolled charts and pointed to a string of numbers that read like a litany. Wind direction, crosswind velocity at varying altitudes, barometric pressure, density altitude. Even the minute correction for the Earth's rotation Coriolis effect, because at 3,200 meters and time of flight measured in seconds, small things were not small. He and Cross debated not like men arguing, but like craftsmen making meticulous adjustments. Then Ramirez looked the rifle scope in his hand, and with a practiced flick, adjusted turrets until the reticle lined with numbers that felt like faith. Visibility, they discovered, was a fickle ally. Morning haze curled in the valley like gauze, and heat shimmer started to rise as the first light warmed the rocks. A distant dog barked below, an ordinary sound that threatened to unwind the careful tapestry of their approach. Cross felt the familiar edge of anxiety, that small electric flare behind the eyes. He shut it down with the same technique he used to steady his trigger finger. Count backwards from 100 by sevens, even during the most delicate parts of calculation. It was ritual, again the refuge of repetition. They set up a perimeter. Ortiz found natural cover and dug shallow hollows behind which he could disappear if discovery happened. Molina tuned a handheld jammer to a frequency that might drown inadvertent pings but not broadcast a signature. The team hid like a secret folded into the mountain. At a distance, the compound looked secure, its lights a constellation of control. Up close, it was merely human doors, people, routines, all suddenly vulnerable to a bullet's arc. Over the next hour, time took on a warped elasticity. The sun rose in increments that mattered. 3 minutes was both a sliver and an abyss. Ramirez kept one eye on the valley and one on his instruments. Cross practiced micro-adjustments to his position, minimizing muscle flex, the way a pianist warms fingers before a single monumental chord. Men of their kind learned to treat seconds as luxury and minutes as danger. When the expected hour approached, Cross crawled into position. His chest pressed to the earth, cheek against the stock. He peered through the scope and saw the world condensed into the reticle. Over the valley, a compound stirred with the sort of normalcy that makes horror possible. Servants moving, a guard shifting, a silhouette emerging from a doorway. The balcony was still empty. Cross willed it into existence with the narrow, irrational faith of a marksman. Then, like a slow, inevitable reveal, El Fantasma stepped out. Cross's breath steadied. Muscles that had trembled for hours stopped twitching. Ramirez whispered the range, then the wind at 3 different elevations, then a final correction. Cross listened. In his ear, the desert sounded translated into numbers. He readied the rifle and made a final adjustment, 1/2 degree of elevation. 2 clicks left to account for a gust funneled down a ravine below. For a suspended moment that seemed to stretch beyond time, the world narrowed to the span of a heartbeat. Cross exhaled slowly and let the mechanics govern him. He was not thinking about ghosts anymore. He was thinking about vectors and harmony, the confluence of human will and simple physics. Then, with a gentle squeeze that was all careful intention and less of release, he fired. The rifle's report was modest from the ridge. Sound behaved oddly in canyons, delayed and redistributed like an afterimage. The bullet began its long, elegant arch toward the balcony, an almost poetic flight that would test every assumption they'd made. For the instant between trigger and impact, there was only the kinetic art of consequences. Below, the compound erupted into motion. Guards screamed, lights flared, and men ran everywhere. On the ridge, Cross remained prone, hands steady, eyes not yet leaving the scope. Ramirez checked for confirmation: visual, auditory, anything that would end the suspense. A figure crumpled on the balcony. A coffee cup spilled and blossomed across stone like a small human stain. They had done what everyone had said was impossible. But the operation was far from over. Patrols would converge. The valley would shake with frantic movement. Drones would be dispatched, and a hunt would begin for the source of the shot. Cross and his men had to become ghosts again, disappear among rocks, shade, and silence. The long crawl was only the prelude. Now the retreat would test them. The land that had served as ally would become an obstacle again, and every step back would require the same measured discipline they had used to get there. They gathered their gear in a practiced ballet, moving quickly but without haste. The mission had done its work, but the mountain asked them to pay for the privilege of leaving. As they melted into shadow and began the long descent, Cross allowed himself a fraction of feeling, a quiet, bleak satisfaction that the impossible had been achieved. The world below would never know the precise mechanics of that 3-minute morning, but lives would change, dominoes would shift, and somewhere a child might sleep a little easier. Still, the ridge did not give up its secrets easily. The long crawl that followed would demand patience, cunning, and a humility born from the close acquaintance with danger. For now, just for a breath, they had stood on a ledge, between history and rumor, and fired a shot that altered both. The sound of the shot had not yet finished bouncing across the ridges when chaos bloomed in the valley below. For months, intelligence officers, special operators, and analysts had built this moment in silence. Now the silence shattered. Guards erupted from barracks, rifles raised, eyes searching for an enemy they could not see. Sirens wailed, dogs barked, radios screamed in clipped Spanish. The fortress that had always radiated control suddenly pulsed with confusion. Cross did not move. His cheek stayed pressed to the rifle stock, eyes still in the scope, following the figure on the balcony. The man had staggered as if tugged backward by an invisible string. Coffee spilled across the stone in a wide, dark splash, the porcelain mug spinning away. El Fantasma collapsed in a slow, graceless arc, his body slamming into the tiles with a sound too faint to reach the ridge, but clear enough through the glass. For a moment, it seemed the myth might rise again. But the body lay still. "Target down," Ramirez whispered, voice low but iron steady. Confirmed. For Cross, there was no cheer, no triumphant exhale. The shot had been a problem solved, an equation closed. The rest was survival. He disengaged from the scope and began dismantling the rifle with swift, silent hands. Each movement was muscle memory. Bolt out, scope detached, barrel shrouded. The weapon that had just ended a rain became another piece of metal folded into a pack. Below, pandemonium mounted. Guards rushed the balcony, some dropping to their knees beside the fallen man, others gesturing frantically toward the ridges. Spotlights crisscrossed the cliffs, long white fingers searching for ghosts in the stone. Trucks roared to life, engines gunning as convoys tore down dirt tracks. Drones, small and insect-like, lifted from launchers, their red lights pulsing against the gray dawn. "Time to move," Ortiz said softly. The team melted backward into the terrain. Every inch mattered now. The ridge that had given them cover would betray them if they lingered. Ortiz led, tracing a descent path no wider than a man's shoulders, zigzagging into gullies that swallowed sound. Cross followed, rifle broken down and packed, his senses sharpened not by adrenaline, but by discipline. Behind him, Ramirez guarded their rear, spotting scope slung across his back like a relic of the shot just made. The first drone buzzed overhead within minutes, its hum low and menacing, the sound of machines learning to hunt. Molina activated a handheld device that spat a field of static across a narrow band of frequencies. It was crude, short-lived, but enough to confuse the drone signal for a few seconds. The team froze under a camouflaged net draped over rocks until the machine drifted past. When silence returned, they moved again, every footstep a negotiation with loose gravel and brittle brush. In the valley, men shouted into radios, their voices bouncing up the cliffs. Ortiz understood enough Spanish to catch the panic. It came from the ridge. Send everyone. Block the roads. Nothing leaves alive. Cross's mind parsed the words, but filed them away. Noise was distraction. The mission was still unfolding, and the margin for error had shrunk to nothing. The team pressed on, hours stretching into a crawl that felt longer than the climb up. Heat thickened as the sun climbed, turning the rocks into ovens. Sweat stung eyes, but no one dared wipe it away. They moved by shadow where possible, hugging cliff faces, ducking under overhangs. Every pause was timed with discipline. 30 seconds to listen, 60 to check bearings, then move again. At one point, Ortiz raised a clenched fist. The team froze, breath throttled. From below, a patrol truck ground along a dirt track, not 50 yards away. Guards leaned from the windows, rifles bristling, eyes scanning the slopes. Dust trailed behind like a scar in the morning air. Cross lay pressed to stone, heartbeat slow, rifle case digging into ribs. Only when the truck groaned around a bend did Ortiz wave them forward again. They descended into a dry arroyo that twisted through the foothills. Here the earth smelled of old water, the ghost of rivers long gone. It offered cover, but it also choked with silence that magnified every scrape of boot leather, every rattle of loose gear. They moved slower, trusting patience over speed. Survival was measured in quiet. Halfway through the arroyo, Alina whispered a warning. A second drone, larger than the first, hovered above the mouth of the canyon. Its camera gimbaled, scanning. This time the jammer would not be enough. The team pressed against the canyon walls, blending into stone, still as fossils. Minutes dragged like hours. The drone hovered, dipped, then pulled away, fooled by terrain and shadows. They did not move until its buzz faded completely into sky. By late afternoon, exhaustion clawed at them. The insertion had taken 40 hours of crawling, climbing, and silence. The exfiltration demanded equal tribute. Cross felt the ache in his shoulders, the stiffness in his trigger hand, but he buried it. Pain was payment, nothing more. Ramirez's lips were cracked, his voice rasped from thirst, yet he still muttered wind directions out of habit, as though the rifle lay in front of them. The ridge finally yielded to lower ground. In the distance, beyond rolling hills, the faint smear of the extraction zone waited, a patch of scrubland where, if the timing held, a transport team would arrive under cover of night. Between them and safety, however, stretched open terrain that offered little cover. Every movement risked exposure. They waited until dusk. The sky turned blood orange, then indigo. Shadows lengthened, cloaking them in anonymity. Ortiz scanned the horizon, then gave a curt nod. It was time. They moved in a staggered file, spacing out to minimize the chance of all being caught in one sweep. Each man's shadow became his cloak, each breath rationed like water. From the compound, sirens still echoed faintly. Helicopters circled the valley, searchlights stabbing into darkness. The enemy was frantic, but frenzy was not precision. The hunters were hunting in all directions, blind to the fact that the ghosts they sought had already slipped through the cracks. Hours later, the team reached the extraction point. It was nothing glamorous, just a dirt clearing hidden by low mesquite. They crouched in silence, waiting, listening for rotors. Every minute felt like a year. Cross checked his watch, then glanced at Ramirez. The spotter gave a small nod, the closest thing to reassurance. Finally, The faint thrum of engines rolled across the night. A transport helicopter appeared, running dark, its silhouette a shadow against deeper shadow. It descended without lights, blades chopping the silence into urgency. The team sprinted the last yards, bent low, packs bouncing. Cross climbed aboard last, turning once to scan the horizon. In the valley behind, the fortress still burned with spotlights, men still searching, radios still shrieking. But on the balcony lay a still body, its myth ended by a bullet's long journey. The ghost had fallen. As the helicopter lifted, dust swirling, Cross leaned back into the seat. Ramirez met his eyes, and for the first time in days, a flicker of expression broke through. A tired half-smile, not of triumph, but of survival. The mission was over. The hardest crawl, the impossible shot, the perilous retreat done. The team would return to silence, to anonymity, to stories never told. Officially, El Fantasma's death would be chalked up to cartel infighting, perhaps an internal betrayal. No mention of a sniper on a ridge, no acknowledgement of the crawl that had bent time itself. But the men who had lived it would never forget. And somewhere, in the cool halls of Langley and the Pentagon, analysts marked the file closed. A ghost had been hunted, and for once, the hunters had proven that even myths bleed. The helicopter rose into the night like a ghost of its own, blades tearing the desert air into ribbons of sound. Inside, Cross and his team sat strapped to the benches, sweat-soaked, dust-caked, and silent. They had made it. The mission that had begun as an impossible equation now seemed to settle into the calm certainty of survival. But survival is fragile. 2 minutes into their ascent, Ortiz's headset crackled with Molina's voice. "We've got heat starboard side." Through the open door, the horizon lit with pinpricks of orange. Tracer fire stitched the sky, climbing toward them in long, glowing arcs. Cartel trucks, hastily assembled along a ridgeline, had mounted heavy machine guns onto their beds. The gunners opened fire, spraying the night sky with angry fireflies of lead. The pilot banked hard, the helicopter lurching sideways. Loose gear rattled. Cross braced against the sudden drop, eyes flicking toward Ramirez, who was already calculating angles, even in retreat. They had expected search parties, maybe drones, but anti-air fire. This far out meant El Fantasma's men had moved faster than intelligence had predicted. The team gritted against gravity as the helicopter dipped, then climbed again. "They're tracking us," Molina shouted over the roar. His tablet flickered with radar sweeps. "Multiple vehicles, pushing our vector. They'll stay under us all night if they can." The pilot's voice cut in, clipped and calm. "We can't outrun this in the open. They'll chew us apart." No one spoke the obvious. This mission had been meant to vanish in silence. If the helicopter was shot down, evidence of American involvement would spill across cartel territory in flames. "Options?" Cross asked, his voice steady. "Only one," the pilot replied. "We dive low and ride the terrain. Keep their line of sight broken. But it'll be rough." The helicopter dropped like a hawk diving for prey. Valleys swallowed them, mountains rose around them, and the chopper threaded canyons at breakneck speed. Spotlights from pursuing trucks swept the skies, but the pilot twisted, banking so tight that men inside gripped their straps until knuckles whitened. Cross scanned the darkness below. Roads wound like pale scars through the hills, headlights bouncing as cartel convoys pursued. Trucks with mounted weapons, motorcycles with scouts, even a few captured military vehicles, all surging after the invisible enemy that had taken their ghost away. Contact left. Ortiz shouted. From a ridge, another burst of tracer fire erupted, crossing their path like fiery spears. The pilot jerked the helicopter into a near-vertical climb, rotors screaming against thin desert air. A round punched through the fuselage, tearing metal but sparing flesh. The smell of oil and burned powder filled the cabin. The team returned fire. Cross swung his rifle from the doorway, not for precision now, but suppression. Bullets cracked the night, silencing one of the gunners on the ridge. Ramirez and Ortiz joined in, their controlled bursts carving darkness into sparks. The convoy below slowed, but did not stop. The helicopter skimmed lower, rotors kicking up sandstorms that blinded pursuers. Dust swirled into a thick veil, but the price was turbulence that shook every bolt in the craft. The pilot fought the stick, cursing into his mic, sweat dripping down his temples. "Extraction zone compromised," Molina reported, eyes locked on his screens. "They've guessed our path. Trucks are converging. If we land there, we'll walk into a kill box." Cross leaned forward, voice calm despite the chaos. "We need an alternate. Something off-grid. Somewhere they don't expect." Molina's fingers flew over his tablet, scanning terrain maps. "There's a dry lake bed 20 clicks east. No roads in, no settlements. It's open, but that means no cover." "Better open than dead," Cross said. "Plot it." The pilot banked hard again, swinging them east. The helicopter's frame groaned, but the machine obeyed. Behind them, the convoys adjusted, headlights bending like snakes in pursuit. Minutes passed like hours. The chase became a rhythm. Bursts of gunfire, evasive dives, sudden climbs. Once, a drone swooped low, its camera glinting red. Ramirez sighted it through his rifle and squeezed. The drone shattered mid-air, spiraling into the hills in a shower of sparks. "Nice shot," Ortiz muttered. Ramirez didn't smile. "Just evening the odds." The dry lake bed appeared at last, a wide, pale scar on the earth, gleaming faintly under the moon. The pilot descended fast, landing gear biting into cracked earth. The helicopter settled with a groan, rotors still screaming. "Out now!" The pilot barked. The team spilled onto the ground, weapons ready. The plan was crude. Hold the perimeter until extraction birds from deeper inside friendly territory could arrive. This wasn't supposed to happen. There wasn't supposed to be a firefight, but missions rarely honored plans. Cartel vehicles crested a ridge to the west, headlights glaring. Machine guns barked, spraying the lake bed with glowing arcs. The SEALs hit the ground, returning fire in controlled, lethal bursts. Cross picked targets with surgical precision, each shot dropping a gunner, each reload done by touch alone. Ortiz deployed claymores along the approach, the dull clicks of their arming switches like punctuation in the chaos. Ramirez fed cross-wind corrections even here, the partnership unbroken. Half right, 200 meters. Adjust 3 clicks. Explosions rippled as the first claymores detonated, fire and steel shredding the front line of trucks. Screams echoed across the lake bed. The cartel convoys faltered, but more followed, headlights stretching like an angry river across the desert. Above, the faint thrum of distant rotors grew louder. Friendly reinforcements were inbound Black Hawks bristling with miniguns, their silhouettes cutting across the moon. Relief flickered in the teens' veins, but the fight wasn't done. The cartel threw everything forward in a final surge, desperate to claim the killers of their ghost. The lake bed erupted into a storm of fire and steel. Cross felt the ground tremble under heavy trucks, the air rip with tracer rounds. He fired until the barrel glowed, every shot buying seconds. Then the reinforcements arrived. Black Hawks screamed into the night, guns blazing. Minigun fire tore through convoys like lightning through trees. Trucks exploded, men scattered, and the desert became a canvas of chaos. The cartel's offensive collapsed under the weight of superior firepower. Survivors fled into the hills, leaving behind burning wreckage and silence broken only by rotor thunder. The seals sprinted to the waiting birds, packs bouncing, lungs burning. Cross was last again, turning once to scan the horizon. In the distance, smoke rose from the direction of El Fantasma's fortress, a plume marking the end of an empire. They lifted into the sky, this time with escort, the Black Hawks forming a protective circle. Below, the desert shrank, leaving only scars of fire where a cartel's wrath had met its match. Inside, the team sat in silence, exhaustion finally cracking through adrenaline. Ortiz leaned his head back, eyes closed. Ramirez checked his gear one last time, ritual even when spent. Molina tapped his screen, sending encrypted bursts that confirmed mission success to command. Cross sat still, eyes unfocused, hearing only the echo of the shot. The bullet that had traveled 3,200 meters now seemed louder in memory than the miniguns had been. It wasn't triumph he felt, nor even relief. It was weight, the knowledge that myths end with noise, but the silence afterward belongs to the men who pulled the trigger. The ghost had fallen, but ghosts had followers, and shadows had long memories. The war was not over. It never was. The desert dawn arrived pale and bruised, streaks of violet and red bleeding across the sky, as if the earth itself had been scarred by the night's battle. The convoy of Black Hawks thundered eastward, leaving behind burning wreckage, shredded steel, and the silence of men who would never tell their story. For the SEALs, the mission was over, but its consequences were only beginning. Cross sat slumped against the bench of the helicopter, helmet off, hair plastered with sweat and dust. His weapon rested across his lap, the barrel scorched from the night's endless firing. Around him, his brothers were ghosts of themselves, faces hollowed by exhaustion, eyes fixed on nothing. No one spoke. Words would have felt too fragile, too small, against what they had endured. The pilot's voice came through the headset, crossing into friendly airspace. 10 mics to forward operating base. A ripple of relief passed through the cabin. It was subtle shoulders unclenching, hands loosening their grips, but it was there. They had survived. Against all odds, they had survived. But the weight of the mission pressed heavier with every mile. El Fantasma, the cartel king who had ruled with fire and terror, was dead. Yet killing a ghost did not kill his army. The SEALs knew this. Everyone in the chain of command knew this. Removing the head of the serpent was only the first step. The body could still thrash. The silent landing at the forward operating base, there were no banners, no medals waiting, no speeches. Only silence. The Black Hawks touched down, and the team was ushered into a hangar lit by fluorescent lights that buzzed against the stillness. Commanders in plain uniforms waited, their faces carved from stone. Mission accomplished? One asked, though the answer was written in every line of their bodies. Cross nodded once. Target neutralized. Confirmed kill. No applause. No handshake. Just a curt nod from the commander, who scribbled something into a folder already thick with secrets. You'll be debriefed separately. Communications blackout remains in effect. Not a word leaves this compound. Understood? Understood, the team replied in unison. And that was it. Years of training, months of planning, and one impossible shot distilled into a classified file that might never see daylight. The World Reacts news traveled fast, though not the truth. By the second day, rumors rippled through cartel territories in Mexico. El Fantasma had been assassinated on his balcony by rivals. By the third day, Mexican newspapers printed grainy photos of the compound's destruction, speculating about civil war within the cartel. By the week's end, whispers crossed the border into the United States. The ghost was gone. But the official story never mentioned America. No press conference claimed responsibility. No headline credited a sniper. Governments stayed silent, letting rumors do their work. For the communities who had suffered under the cartel's violence, the effect was immediate. Streets once patrolled by armored convoys grew quiet. Extortion rackets collapsed overnight. The aura of invincibility, the belief that the ghost could not be touched, shattered like glass. Still, the vacuum bred chaos. Rival cartels surged forward, eager to claim the ghost's empire. Violence flared in some cities, even worse than before. But to those who had lived under El Fantasma's shadow, his death was a sign, a reminder that no monster was untouchable. Shadows in the barracks, back at the base, Cross cleaned his rifle in silence. The ritual soothed him, each swipe of the cloth across the barrel, a reminder that precision came from discipline. Ramirez sat nearby, staring at his scope, as if it still held the face of the man they had killed. Ortiz joked half-heartedly about breakfast rations, but couldn't mask the hollowness in his laugh. Molina typed silently at his terminal, encrypting reports, scrubbing coordinates, erasing footprints. He paused only once, glancing at Cross. "You know no one will ever believe it," he said quietly. Cross didn't look up. "Doesn't matter if they believe. It matters that it's done." "But a shot like that—" Molina shook his head. "It's legend already. And legends don't stay buried forever." Cross said nothing. He knew Molina was right. In the world of special operations, whispers traveled. Operators from other units would hear pieces of the story, fragments stitched together until myth blurred with truth. A sniper who had reached across 2 miles to kill a ghost, that was the kind of story that lived long after names were forgotten. Washington's chessboard. In Washington, the strike set off a chain reaction hidden from public eyes. Politicians congratulated each other in private chambers. Intelligence directors debated the consequences. Was eliminating the ghost a victory, or had it set the stage for worse violence? One senator, briefed in a secure room, leaned back in his chair and muttered, "We've made him a martyr. The people he ruled will either rise against the chaos or rally around his memory. Either way, blood will spill." Another official countered, "It doesn't matter. We've proven what we needed to prove, that no one is untouchable. Not terrorists. Not dictators. Not cartel kings." The debate ended with silence, as it always did. The mission was classified. The arguments would never reach the public. And the sniper's name was reduced to a line of ink buried under red tape. The sniper's reflection late one night. Cross walked alone along the perimeter of the base. The desert stretched endless in every direction, stars like cold fire above. He thought of the moment his finger had tightened on the trigger, the silence before the shot broke, the eternity before the bullet reached its mark. He had killed before, many times. But this was different. Not because of who the target was, but because of what the shot represented. 2 miles of distance, years of preparation, and a nation's burden balanced on the weight of a single squeeze. He remembered Ramirez's voice in his ear, calm, precise. Remembered the balcony, the coffee cup, the ghost's sudden fall. Somewhere out there, families would sleep easier. Somewhere else, blood would be spilled in retaliation. And in the middle, Cross stood, caught between pride and the quiet ache of carrying history that would never be written in his name. The legend within months, stories spread in hushed tones among the cartel survivors. Some swore the ghost had been betrayed by his own men. Others claimed an American drone had fired from the skies. But the most persistent tale, whispered in bars and safe houses, was of a bullet that had crossed 2 miles of desert to end him. The details changed with each telling, but the myth remained. A sniper, unseen and untouchable, had plucked their leader from his fortress, as if death itself had a trigger finger. Among SEALs, the story surfaced too, in fragments. New recruits heard rumors of the 3,200-meter shot. No one confirmed it. No one denied it. And in the silence, the legend grew. Epilogue: The ghost's echo. Months later, Cross returned home. He walked through an airport unnoticed, a man like any other, blending into the crowd. Families reunited, businessmen hurried, children laughed. No one knew the weight he carried, the history etched into his hands. He never spoke of the mission. Not to friends, not to family. The file remained sealed, locked in the archives of a government that would never admit its truth. But sometimes, in the quiet of night, when the world was still, Cross would hear it again, the whisper of wind across his scope, the long silence between trigger and impact, the memory of a ghost falling. And he knew, as surely as he knew the feel of a rifle in his hands, that some missions live forever, not in headlines, not in medals, but in the shadows, where warriors carry the burden of impossible things. The ghost was gone, but legends remain.